An interview that started as a routine political conversation quickly escalates into a fiery showdown. When Ethan, the fearless host, challenges Donald Trump on his controversial past, tensions soar, and the former president's responses leave everyone in the room questioning the true cost of his leadership. What happens when the spotlight shines too brightly? Find out in a conversation that will leave you speechless. The studio lights flashed on, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Ethan Carter, the host of The Carter Report, sat at his desk, trying to calm the nerves that had been building all day. This wasn't just another interview. Today, he would sit across from Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. For weeks, the media had speculated about what would happen when Trump sat down with Ethan. The public was hungry for answers, and Ethan was ready to ask the tough questions. Trump entered the room with his characteristic confidence, walking towards the stage like a man who had been in the spotlight his entire life. His tailored suit and perfectly combed hair made him look every bit the political icon he was. Ethan stood to greet him, offering a firm handshake, feeling the weight of the moment. They sat down, facing each other. The cameras were rolling and the audience was silent, waiting for the first question. Ethan cleared his throat and began. Mr. Trump, thank you for being here today. Let's start with your time in office. You often speak of your successes, but do you believe your presidency truly made America better? Or were there unintended consequences? Trump leaned back in his chair, flashing a confident smile. Ethan, I'll tell you what I told everyone else. When I was in office, America was strong. We had the best economy, the best military, and the best jobs. People were proud to be Americans again. No one did it better than me. Ethan pressed further, his voice steady. I understand that, but many feel that your time in office also deepened divisions, racial tensions, protests, and unrest. How do you respond to those who believe your rhetoric contributed to that? Trump's expression hardened. Look, I did what was best for the country. The media loves to focus on the negative, but the people I worked for, the forgotten ones, they saw real change under my leadership. The media twist everything I say. Ethan wasn't backing down. But isn't it possible, Mr. Trump, that your words sometimes fueled that division, whether you intended it or not? Trump's face tightened, but he deflected quickly. I'm not responsible for other people's actions. If some people took things the wrong way, that's not on me. I've always called for peace. Ethan knew he had to push harder. What about the January 6th Capitol riot? Your words were a factor in what happened that day. Don't you think as president you had a responsibility to ensure your rhetoric didn't incite violence? For a moment, Trump's composure faltered, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. But he quickly recovered, shaking his head. I didn't cause any violence. The media loves to blame me for everything. Ethan leaned forward, sensing the shift. But don't you agree that leaders are responsible for the impact their words have on others? Trump shot back. I'm not taking responsibility for what others do. I did my best to make America great again. The people know the truth. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan had pushed Trump into a corner, but the former president wasn't ready to admit fault. The interview was far from over, and Ethan could feel the weight of the next questions hanging in the air. Ethan's heart raced as he watched Trump adjust his suit, clearly getting more comfortable with the exchange. But Ethan wasn't about to let him off the hook. He had to keep pressing to make sure the audience saw the truth behind Trump's responses. Mr. Trump, Ethan began, you've always insisted that your administration's policies created jobs and improved the economy. But many argue that your economic policies disproportionately benefited the wealthy. What would you say to those who feel like they were left behind during your presidency? Trump's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward, a familiar glint in his eyes. Ethan, you don't understand. We created the best economy the world has ever seen. It wasn't just the wealthy, it was everyone. Jobs were coming back and people were thriving. You're just listening to the fake news. Ethan remained calm. But statistics show that income inequality rose during your time in office. The wealth gap widened. Can you deny that some of your policies favored the rich over the working class? Trump's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his confidence. No, that's just the left-wing narrative. The truth is, I helped the economy in ways you wouldn't understand. I cut taxes, created jobs, and made America a force to be reckoned with. Ethan wasn't convinced. But the people who needed help the most didn't see the benefits of your tax cuts. How do you justify that? Trump paused for a moment, clearly trying to gather his thoughts. You don't get it, Ethan. I did what was best for the country. The tension in the room was growing, and it was clear this was turning into a battle neither side was willing to back down from. As the interview continued, the air in the studio grew heavier. Ethan had successfully ruffled Trump's feathers with his probing questions, but the former president wasn't about to let things slide. He sat straighter in his chair, trying to regain the upper hand. The camera lights gleamed down, and Ethan could feel the weight of the moment. He knew that now more than ever, he had to stay sharp. Mr. Trump, Ethan started, I want to talk about something that has been at the forefront of many minds, your relationship with the media. You've often referred to the press as fake news, but many people believe that your attacks on the media were a direct attempt to discredit anyone who criticized you. How do you justify your actions? Trump's lips twisted into a tight smile. The media has been against me from day one, Ethan. They've lied, twisted facts, and spread negativity. You know it's true. My administration did more for this country than any other, but the media couldn't stand it. They'd rather spread lies than give credit where it's due. Ethan, sensing an opening, pressed on. But Mr. Trump, by calling the media fake news so often, didn't you create an atmosphere of distrust? Your followers often took your words to heart, sometimes even turning against journalists and the press. Isn't that dangerous for a democracy? Trump scoffed. You're missing the point. The media was biased. They were out to get me from the start. And when they lie, it's my job to call them out. I had to stand up for the truth. Ethan's expression remained calm, but his voice grew more pointed. But at what cost, Mr. Trump? You've undermined public trust in institutions that are crucial to a healthy democracy. Don't you think that has a lasting impact on the country? Trump's face tightened, his usual confidence slipping for a brief moment. He quickly regained composure, leaning forward. I did what I had to do to protect the people. The media was the real problem. The tension was palpable. Ethan had caught Trump in a rare moment of vulnerability, but Trump was determined to deflect, refusing to take full responsibility. The battle of words was far from over. The room was thick with tension as Trump's deflection skills came into play once again. Ethan knew he had to hit harder to bring out a side of Trump that couldn't be easily dismissed. The audience waited with bated breath, sensing that this moment could be the turning point in the interview. Mr. Trump, Ethan said, leaning forward slightly, I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about your handling of the pandemic. Many Americans felt that your administration downplayed the severity of COVID-19. In hindsight, do you think you could have done more to protect the public? Trump's face stiffened and his eyes narrowed. Let me tell you something, Ethan. No one has ever done more to combat a crisis than I did. I closed the borders, pushed for a vaccine, and saved millions of lives. The media only wants to focus on the negative, but we did what we had to do. Ethan pressed on, undeterred, but critics argue that your administration's initial response was too slow. You downplayed the virus for weeks, even months. That allowed the virus to spread further, putting people's lives at risk. Don't you think that was a mistake? Trump's eyes flared with anger. I did everything right. The economy was booming, and then we had to face an unprecedented situation. You can't blame me for what happened. No one knew how bad it was going to get. Ethan didn't back down. But the public needed leadership in that moment, and many believe your leadership failed them. Do you think history will remember your handling of the pandemic as a failure? Trump's jaw clenched, but he refused to answer directly. History will judge me fairly. I did my best. And that's all I can say. Ethan knew this interview wasn't going to be easy, but the truth was starting to surface. The challenge was getting Trump to face it. Ethan watched as Trump shifted in his seat, clearly growing defensive. This wasn't the first time the former president had faced tough questions, but the intensity of the interview was beginning to wear on him. Ethan knew he had to keep the pressure on if he wanted to uncover the deeper truths beneath Trump's carefully crafted narrative. Mr. Trump, Ethan continued, let's talk about your leadership style. You've often touted your ability to make tough decisions, but your critics say that your leadership was often erratic, driven by personal ego rather than the country's best interests? How do you respond to that? Trump's eyes flashed, the familiar fire igniting in his gaze. Let me tell you, Ethan, no one knows leadership better than I do. I made decisions that no one else would have had the guts to make. I didn't follow the status quo. That's what people liked about me. I wasn't a politician. I was a leader who got things done. Ethan nodded but wasn't swayed. But wasn't that approach, Mr. Trump, part of the reason why your administration was so divided? You alienated allies, ignored expert advice, and often acted impulsively. Doesn't that kind of leadership create more chaos than progress? Trump's face tightened, and his voice became more pointed. I didn't care about pleasing everyone. I did what was best for the country. People don't like hearing the truth, but I always spoke my mind. That's what made me different. I didn't play the game like the politicians before me. Ethan took a deep breath, sensing the tension rising. But sometimes, Mr. Trump, leadership requires compromise, diplomacy, and listening to others. Your decisions often seemed driven by what was good for you politically, not the nation as a whole. Trump gripped the armrest, clearly feeling the weight of the question. I was elected to make the hard decisions, not to be liked. I didn't need approval to do what was right for the country. Ethan's eyes narrowed, but he kept his tone steady. But when your decisions alienated so many, how can you claim they were right for the country? The studio was almost unnervingly quiet as Trump sat in his chair, a hint of frustration in his posture. His usual bravado was starting to crack under the pressure. Ethan could sense he had struck a chord, and he wasn't about to let up. He had come this far, and now he needed to push further, to expose the complexities of Trump's leadership. Mr. Trump, Ethan began, his voice calm but deliberate. Throughout your presidency, you often claimed that you were a champion of the people, the forgotten man. But your critics argue that your policies largely benefited the wealthy and corporations. How do you reconcile those two contrasting views? Trump let out a short laugh, leaning forward again. Ethan, you're looking at it all wrong. The people who are critical of me don't understand how the economy works. When the economy grows, everyone benefits. The wealthy, the corporations, they create jobs. It's a trickle-down effect. The poor benefit too when the economy is booming. Ethan remained unfazed. But don't you think that trickle-down economics has been widely discredited? Many argue that it only deepens the inequality. How do you explain the growing gap between the rich and the rest of the country under your policies? Trump's expression turned defensive. That's just liberal nonsense. My policies were about growth, about making America stronger. The rich get richer, sure, but that means more jobs for everyone. The media likes to twist the facts, but people know the truth. Ethan, knowing this was a critical moment, pressed on. But what about the working class, Mr. Trump? Their wages have remained stagnant for years. How do you explain that? Trump paused, his lips curling into a tight smile. They were better off than ever under me. They just don't see it. The tension in the room was palpable. Trump's answer was unsatisfactory, but he wouldn't admit fault. Ethan knew this was a fight that would not be easily won. The clock was ticking, and Ethan knew that time was running out. He had asked the hard questions, but there was one subject he hadn't tackled yet, the most controversial moment of Trump's presidency. The one event that would define his legacy. Ethan had to address it. The audience waited, eager to see how Trump would react to the final question. Mr. Trump, Ethan said, his tone turning more serious, I think it's time to address January 6th, 2021, the Capitol riot. You were the sitting president when it happened, and many have held you accountable for your role in inciting the violence. Do you accept any responsibility for what occurred that day? Trump's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he prepared for the inevitable. This was the question he had been dreading. The room grew tense, the cameras focusing on him, awaiting his response. He cleared his throat before answering. Ethan, I have always called for peace, Trump said, his voice rising slightly. I never wanted anyone to be hurt. What happened on January 6th was a tragedy. But let me be clear, people took it too far. I didn't incite violence. What happened that day was on them, not me. Ethan raised an eyebrow. But your rhetoric, your refusal to accept the results of the election, don't you think that fueled the anger and chaos? Many of your supporters believe they were acting on your behalf. Trump shook his head. I never told anyone to storm the Capitol. I told people to protest peacefully. The media wants to blame me for everything, but I wasn't the one causing chaos. Ethan leaned in, his final question hanging in the air. But as a leader, don't you believe you had a responsibility to do more to prevent it? Trump didn't immediately respond. The silence between them was deafening. The silence in the room stretched on, and for a moment, it seemed like Trump was lost in thought. His usual confidence had faded slightly, as if the weight of the question was too heavy to ignore. Ethan, ever the professional, didn't break eye contact, waiting for the former president to find his words. Finally, Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. I've always done what I thought was best for the country, he said, his voice less forceful than before. People misinterpret what I say. I didn't want violence. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. But when you're the leader of this country, you can't control everyone's actions. You can only do so much. Ethan nodded, his tone thoughtful. But many of your supporters were clearly incited by your claims of a stolen election. Isn't that something you should have acted on sooner? Don't you think your words led to their actions? Trump's eyes narrowed. I've already said it, Ethan. I didn't cause the violence. People have their own minds. They make their own choices. It wasn't my fault. Ethan didn't press further. The response was evasive, and everyone in the room knew it. Trump had refused to take responsibility, once again shifting the blame elsewhere. But the damage had been done. The audience was silent, the weight of the conversation lingering. Well, there you have it, Ethan said, turning to the camera. It seems we've come to the end of our interview. As the cameras began to fade, the air in the room seemed to lighten. Trump stood up first, adjusting his jacket, not looking at Ethan. The tension had finally broken. The interview had ended, but the questions and the controversy were far from over.